You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, we're declaring a climate emergency and then doing absolutely nothing about it. But first, is the government wrecking its own planning bill? So, Martin, I've got a massive dilemma this week.
Are you trying to figure out which cat you like the most, James?
No, I could never choose between Hashtag and Boudica. They're both perfect cats.
That's not what you told me in private.
What's bothering me this week, Martin, is that I'm a Westminster elite, right? You know, Westminster people are just dying to talk to me. I'm the talk of the town. I've been corrupted thoroughly by the establishment. I've got a soft network of friends and connections. So I'm an apologist for the ruling regime. I feebly suck at the teat of the status quo. I defend the system in Westminster and all of its ills. But this week, Martin, what ails me is that the government, well, it's disappointed me.
Oh no, the milk has turned sour. What did the government do, James? Did Keir Starmer announce a ban on air conditioning?
It might even be worse than that, Martin. So, you know, we've talked on the show a lot about the planning and infrastructure bill. I think we both probably agree that it's quite an important thing that the government is trying to fix, right?
Yeah, we've talked about this literally endlessly, and steady on, folks, because we're about to again. And it's clearly a good thing, right? If you make it easier to build stuff, then you can have more affordable housing, you can have cheaper energy, give more people in their pockets, more nice things, net zero infrastructure. Obviously, there isn't one neat trick to fix the country, but planning reform's pretty close to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very enthusiastic about the planning bill, but I worry it could be under threat. It could be undermined. But before we get to that, I just want to re-emphasize why this is important for anyone listening, because not everyone is quite as radicalized as we are. So in a nutshell, what's the planning bill going to do? It's going to reduce the number of consultations and opportunities for judicial review on major projects. So if you're building, say, a new high-speed railway line, there'll be less opportunities for NIMBYs to stop it happening or slow it down. It's going to make approving building easier at a local level as well. So like councils won't be able to take as long to decide to build things. Basically, council bureaucrats will make more decisions, and actual full council meetings with all of that acrimony will only decide bigger projects. There's going to be development corporations as well, which are going to be these bodies which can make more planning decisions in sort of strategic opportunity areas. One of the ones I know quite a lot about at the moment, which already exists, is Ebbsfleet, where it's sort of master planning the entire area. Anyway, that's a good idea. And then my favourite aspect of the planning bill is the Nature Restoration Fund, which we've also talked about several times on the show before. So the idea is that when you're building a project, whether it's HS2 or something else, at the moment, the rule is you build a railway line, you've got to mitigate all of the impact on nature yourself as part of the project. And that's how you get problems like the infamous Bat Tunnel, which is costing £100 million. Instead, we're going to have the Nature Restoration Fund, which is a big pot of cash where developers will just pay into that, and the money will be able to be spent more sensibly on, like building a bat sanctuary somewhere else in the country. It's all very sensible, right?
Yeah, it's good for fans of building stuff, but also good for fans of the environment, because ultimately it means that we can invest in strategic things that are going to help bats or newts or fish or whatever your favorite animal is, instead of just pouring money into random insane projects that go kind of out of control. And actually, that's something that's really bugged me in Starmer's whole pitching of this. You know, when he says, "I don't care about newts," and frames it in those terms, it's not really newts versus people or bats versus men. It's both things together. It's Batmen.
Yeah, the official sort of government spin phrase is it's a win-win for nature. And, you know, the bill so far, it's been sailing through Parliament. So it's just gone through the House of Commons. Last month, it finished its third reading, and it's now being kicked upstairs to the House of Lords for Lords to have a look at and suggest how they might want to change it. And this is where the problem begins.
So I assume some ancient lord has woken from his slumber and is worried that, wind turbines are going to mess up his grouse hunt?
It's even weirder than that, Martin. So last week, a bunch of amendments were proposed to the bill by Baroness Taylor of Stevenage. And she's not just any lord, she's actually the housing minister for the government in the Lords. And what she's proposing on behalf of the government is a whole bunch of amendments that would essentially weaken the planning bill and make it less effective.
There is something that seems fundamentally wrong about having a Baroness of Stevenage, but setting that aside, what happened? Did they get bored of other people trying to sabotage it and just decide to have a go themselves for the fun of it?
I thought you'd be all for supporting new towns, Martin. But anyway, no. So, so what appears to have happened, I think, is that big nature got its hands on the government. So obviously, planning reform is going to be a controversial thing. You have to admit that. So groups like the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust have all been kicking off and complaining about it. At the end of May, these groups said that the planning bill was a quote license to kill nature. So what I'm guessing has happened here is that the government has gone back and they're now trying to placate these groups a bit by changing the bill. And they say they're going to add a bunch of so called safeguards to better protect nature and try and assuage their concerns.
And by safeguards, effectively, this is going to mean what? Delays and lots of extra money spent?
Yeah, it could do. And this is sort of the crux of the problem. So the details get really quite complicated. I've been looking through the text of the bill and the amendments and pretending to be a lawyer with the help of ChatGPT. But what it essentially boils down to is what's going to be called environmental delivery plans. These are a new thing that are being created by the bill. And basically, when you have a project, your EDP, your delivery plan, will set out how you mitigate all of the nature impact of whatever you're building. And what the amendments do is they strengthen the legal test for whether developers will be meeting the requirements of these delivery plans. And I guess you might think, well, what's wrong with that? Who doesn't want that? Well, basically, I think the problem is it recreates a lot of the problems that the bill is trying to fix because it creates new opportunities for, NIMBYs and nature charities and so on to challenge decisions that are being made to say, hang on, you're not meeting the bar for this delivery plan. And so it's just another excuse to kick things to judicial review and slow down development and cause all of the problems that have got us into this sort of national mess in the first place.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm still not past the bit where they decided to sabotage their own bill.
Yeah, it's a really strange one. It might even make it harder to stop things like the bat tunnel in the future. So one of the things it will do is it will further empower our good old friends at Natural England. At the moment, as written, when it went up to the Lords, Natural England will have a role in deciding whether, quote, network conservation measures are good enough. This is things like the fund where you pay in and you solve the problem elsewhere, not directly on the site. So for things like the bat tunnel and building a bat sanctuary elsewhere, like I mentioned. And what the amendment essentially does is it raises the bar. It makes it harder for the Secretary of State to exercise their own judgment. So the theory was that the minister might have been able to go, well, this project seems good enough, it's mitigated it good enough, so big tick, carry on. Whereas this gives the minister slightly less wiggle room and basically gives Natural England the final say on things, as far as I can say. As I say, not a lawyer, but that seems to do. It basically makes it harder to mitigate nature and creates those burdens again.
So, Natural England, of course, are the unelected Quango that objected to the building of their own headquarters. So, definitely the kind of people you want making complex, proactive decisions about building and the environment.
Yeah, there's definitely some questionable incentives here, I think. And I think the reason the government has done this is it's basic party management politics. So, people like us, we're really enthusiastic about the planning bill. But like I say, opinion is more mixed, and that's true as well across Parliament as a whole, because though Labour won a massive majority last year, it means that the party now includes tons and tons of different people with quite a diverse set of views. So we've got everyone from friends of the pod, Chris Curtis, who I dare say at this point would probably tarmac over his own mother to build stuff. But that goes all the way to another Chris Hinchcliffe, who is the North East Hertfordshire Labour MP. Before he was elected, he was actually working for the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and he's been one of the big sort of troublemakers on the planning bill for the Labour Party, or at least he was until he was suspended from the Labour whip the other day for both causing trouble on planning and also rebelling on welfare.
Yeah, which makes the whole party management thing just kind of silly. Like, does Starmer think he's micromanaging numbers in some video game? Like, if you suspend an MP from this faction, you lose 10 support points, but, maybe I can get two back with an amendment. It all just feels like very silly, pernickety attempts at micromanagement that are ultimately just going to fail and make everybody miserable.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to work. And to be fair, I think if the bill passed with these amendments on, it would still put us in a much better situation than the one we're in right now without the planning bill having passed. And Dan Tomlinson, another friend of the pod, the Chipping Barnet Labour MP, he was posting just the other day when the news broke about these amendments that he thinks they're much more targeted than sort of previous attempts to wreck the bill. So maybe it won't be all bad, but, I mean this in the nicest possible way, but, like, he would say that because Dan is a very loyal, foot soldier for the government, so he might be right, but every other YIMBY type I know is getting quite mad about this, so, I think there are reasons for concern that the government isn't gonna hold its nerve on the planning bill, and this is important, I think, because compromising I guess it's a bit like say you're trying to lose weight, it's a hard thing to do, you need to hold your nerve and remain disciplined, but if you then decide, "Oh, this is quite hard, so I'm gonna reward myself every time I work out by eating a slice of cake," it's probably not gonna be quite as effective.
Yeah, and honestly, it raises the question like, what are you actually trying to achieve in government at this point? This is like the central plank of your policy for growth. So if you're not going to follow through on that, then why are you even here?
It's a strange one. Martin, do you want some scurrilous, unevidenced speculation?
Oh, I love it, James. Come on.
So, like I say, now I'm a Westminster insider. I talk to Westminster people, and I've had people suggest to me that the housing minister Matthew Pennycook, who's overseeing the bill, he's maybe not as much of a YIMBY ultra as you might expect someone in that role to be. He's maybe a bit more afraid of picking fights with big nature and other groups like that. So maybe that's one of the reasons why these amendments have been put forward. And his department also made a bunch of I dare say slightly strange, unorthodox decisions if building stuff is your ultimate goal. So a little while ago, Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister who's in charge of housing, even above Matthew Pennycook, she actually announced a thing called a delayed home penalty that would weirdly punish developers if they slow down on house building.
Yes, we talked about this last week, the various reasons why house building can seem to go slower than it could do. And we won't go over the whole thing again here, but basically, I think that the top headlines are firstly that land banking is largely a myth, but where developers are slowing down house building, it's because otherwise they take a massive hit on land prices. And land prices are set according to the expected market value of the houses that you're going to build on them. So they're kind of forced to make sure that the prices maintain that value and they don't flood the market and reduce the price and make a loss. So it's kind of an odd punishment that doesn't really address the actual underlying issue of high land prices for development.
Yeah, and I think it shows that though Keir Starmer famously said that he was a YIMBY, he identified with that label and says he's someone who wants to build that maybe not everyone in the government is quite on the same page, which is unfortunate. But I think it's really worth holding their nerve on this if Downing Street can and not putting forward amendments like this, because I think what they essentially do is ratchet back the progress. So, if you imagine the planning bill on a continuum, right? The planning bill takes planning several notches more towards building stuff, which is great, several steps forwards. But then if these amendments get tacked onto the bill, it moves things back a bit, which means less progress and it's slightly less easier to build than it should be.
Yeah, and again, this sort of feels like it's about micromanaging who's happy and who's not happy, but ultimately, nobody's going to be that happy with it. Everyone's going to be pissed off.
Yeah, I worry it'll end up a bit like the welfare bill, which if you remember that shit show from a few weeks ago. So the welfare bill, whatever you think about the underlying policies on that, and to be clear, I'm a bit nervous about cutting welfare spending because I like people to have money. But at the same time, the idea was, well, we passed the welfare bill and it saves public money, which is good for the public finances. But then the government were twisted in so many different directions and made so many different concessions. It ended up saving about half the money it should have done. So the bill wasn't quite as effective. There was something called the welfare bill, but it didn't save that much money, and everyone was just a bit angry and upset afterwards, which was just made the whole thing a little bit pointless and frustrating. And the other example I can't help but think of in this case is in America a few years ago. This is quite a famous example. There was the Democrats passed under Biden a $42 billion rural broadband program to try and roll out rural broadband. Sounds like a great idea. But then they made the process of distributing the cash so difficult, so complex, so bureaucratized, so much paperwork and so on. And the program ended up helping virtually no one. And we saw how that ended up. So this is basically my worry with the planning bill and these amendments, because unless we go all out on actually fixing the problem with Britain's inability to build, because that's at the root of so many of our problems, then the bill might not actually work. We might not actually solve these problems. We might change the planning laws and not fix anything, or at least not fix anything as well as we could.
Yeah, and it comes back to I just don't really understand what the government is for at this point. Like, you've got a bigger majority of the Jesus, you've got 5 years of pure, unadulterated power, country that is voting for radical change, that desperately needs it to kickstart growth again and get the economy working. And you're kind of cowering in your office, fiddling with amendments because you're scared of a few lobbyists. And as you sort of pointed out with the case of rural broadband in the States, do you want reform? Because that's how you get reform. So it's not exactly inspiring stuff, James, but do you know what is inspiring?
I don't know. Have you been watching Strange New Worlds as well this week?
Not yet, so no spoilers, please. But no, it's our subscriber numbers, James, which are
Ah,
continuing to rocket up at unprecedented rates. Now, we've managed to get access through your Westminster Insider contacts to, I've heard, an actual PDF of the planning bill. And for every 100 new subscribers this week, we promise to delete one amendment. That's right, we are guaranteeing that we will delete an actual amendment from the planning bill for every 100 new subscribers. My finger is literally hovering over the delete button right now, James. So come on, people, let's get this done.
nobody tell the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, Martin.
So, James, if I said that there was an emergency, like the building is on fire or Matt Goodwin has tweeted praise for the pod, how would you react to that?
I think I would first try to desperately remember cognitive behavioral therapy. What does it think of? Look around, see five things and what you can smell and things like that to try and calm down. But I think realistically, if it was something as horrifying as Matt Goodwin saying something nice about us, I would probably massively freak out and panic and cause a scene.
Yeah, exactly. So you would be flapping around and trying to smell things, apparently. I'm a bit of a calmer person. I'd probably start making a complicated spreadsheet to deal with the situation, maybe commence a bit of stakeholder engagement. But ultimately, I think you'd agree, both of us would prioritize that emergency, right?
Yeah, that's what you do in an emergency. If something is an emergency, you react to it straight away because it's an emergency.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we have sirens on emergency vehicles because they need to get straight to the emergency and deal with it. What they don't do, hopefully, is I don't know, go on a drive-through or have a cup of tea in the park first. So, James, are you familiar with something called climate change?
Yes, I am. That's why I'm currently sat here basking under the cool, refreshing air of my air conditioner.
Yeah, air conditioning is the future, James. But yeah, so it's a serious thing. It could fundamentally alter our way of life. It could cause issues for our food security, national security. It could trigger mass migrations, water shortages, and it could even make our home offices very annoyingly hot for 5 days of the year. So it seems pretty reasonable, right? That various councils, over about 300 of them, in fact, have declared a climate emergency in recent years. Now, one of those councils is or was Durham County Council. They declared an official climate emergency back in 2019, following an earlier declaration several years before that.
Okay, Martin, but what actually does declaring a climate emergency do? Is it like when we posted a black square on Instagram and solved racism?
Kind of similar. So it's a little bit more than that. And it always reminds me when people say this of like one, two, three, four, I declare a thumb war, but I think it's a bit more legally binding than that. So essentially it's a way that councils have decided to set targets to reduce carbon emissions and decrease their carbon footprint, reduce their shoe size, if you like. But it's using activist language, which is something I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with public institutions doing because it kind of feels like a hostage to fortune, right? Climate change is obviously happening. It's obviously important. We need to do something about it. But declaring an emergency, it sounds a bit like 24 hours to save the NHS, which we used to hear roughly every 24 hours. It's a bit political, it's a bit hysterical, and it turns an obviously sensible thing, which is, being energy efficient and clean is good financially and good for the environment. It takes that into basically a kind of culture war topic. I don't know, it's just kind of weird language to me. And now, obviously, 6 years later, that solidly Labour council in Durham County has fallen to a reform landslide. And guess what, James?
Let me guess. They've doubled down. They've declared, yes, we agree. Climate change is very important. We're going to redouble our efforts to fight the scourge of climate change and protect our planet.
Well, you're right in the sense that they do mention the phrase climate change, but not exactly that. So the new deputy leader, Darren Grimes, who's this sort of like love child of Matt Goodwin and Wesley Crusher from Star Trek: The Next Generation, the sort of weird guy who spends too much time following Americans on Twitter, has put forward a motion to rescind the climate emergency. They're going to undeclare the climate emergency. This is alongside other major policies, which seem to amount to things like renaming council departments to remove words that they don't like. And they've also pledged to fix all potholes within 24 hours, which, at the risk of quoting Bane from Dark Knight Rises, is admirable but mistaken.
Martin, people say you're getting old when police officers start looking younger. Well, I'm starting to feel old now because Darren Grimes is 31.
Yeah, it seems unlikely from any picture I've seen of him, but if you say so.
So, Martin, what you're saying is County Durham, they're firmly in the sort of find out stage of fuck around and find out, I guess. But what does this actually mean for net zero? Because surely if net zero skeptics are in charge, then that's going to be pretty bad for the climate, right?
So, for the sake of balance, before I completely pile on them, we should say that the council's been fairly good at meeting its own carbon reduction targets in the last decade. It's received awards, in fact, for how much it's reduced its CO2 footprint. It's been praised for its use of green technologies in various pieces of council infrastructure. And maybe I'm hopelessly naive here, but as good as that is, it's hard to see how reform are really going to change that much about the progress. So, if you look at the carbon footprint of any council, the main sources of that are going to be basically vehicles and buildings. So, electricity, heating, fuel consumption. And ultimately, new buildings have to be efficient, and you want your buildings to be more efficient to reduce your electricity bills. The grid, as we talked about before, is decarbonizing, so we can have all that lovely summer air conditioning that we're looking forward to, and vehicles are going electric. So, unless reform starts some kind of bonfire of the vanities to burn all the library books, or they go around in coal fired steam tractors to fill all the potholes, I don't really see how they stop progress. It's like King Canut trying to hold back the tide, but with two of the letters swapped around.
Well, Martin, one thing I do know about the new reform administration is that they're generating a lot of hot air. Thank you. I'm here all week. No, so Martin, the council though they do all this. They've got buildings and things, obviously, but they're also in charge of planning. So could they hold up, renewable projects? Can they stop solar farms from happening? Is there a risk that they could slow down wind turbines from being built?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a risk that reform coming in could block these projects from happening. And we know that there's a risk because that's what the Labour led council have been doing for the last decade anyway.
Oh, that's of course.
So, a wind farm at Sheraton Farm was blocked by councillors who insisted that there was currently an oversupply of wind farms in County Durham and that
We're
they
just
shouldn't.
too climate friendly, Martin. We're just doing too
Exactly.
much to help.
We
We're just too good at this.
we just care too much, and so they thought they shouldn't really build any more since the county had already exceeded its 2020 targets. And Graham Morris, the local Labour MP, is a big supporter of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which is a private member's bill that's been kind of bimbling around Parliament for the last 5 years or so. He objected to the wind turbines on the basis that County Durham has fulfilled its wind energy requirements. We've ticked that box, done enough, emergency over. Some other council can deal with the problem.
So does County Durham have like a microclimate? Is it not affected by what's going on in the rest of the world there? Are they in like a bubble dome or something? Like, as long as they've done enough, they're fine, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this could be connected to their previous project to build a gigantic dome over County Durham, but I don't know, presumably. But as well as being completely hostile to wind farms, they've also blocked solar energy at every point. So, one of Reform's first actions on the council has been to block a proposed solar farm at Haswell Plough. And you might think, oh, that's pretty bad. Reform are already having an impact. But again, Labour's fearless radical climate activist Graham Morris was already on the case and completely supported Reform's actions. There's an amazing quote on the BBC where he says, the thought of residents being surrounded by solar panels is distressing, as if they're all going to like swarm down from the farms and start harassing people at bus stops or something. Like, what? And this is the same guy who signed an early day motion about the urgency of the climate crisis and literally called for the unleashing of cheap and abundant renewables.
So I guess Labour were already blocking solar long before Reform got in the first place.
Yeah, so it's not even the first solar farm that they've blocked this year. Another development at Burnhope was blocked by the planning committee under Labour back in March, and this was on farmlands that the farmers pointed out couldn't really be used for livestock or crops. Interestingly, the Council for the Protection of Rural England again tried to disagree and said actually it's grade C farmland, technically you could use it, but the farmers came back and said, hey, it's flooded most of the year and it's pretty much the soil structure is an absolute disaster. So those fields are basically just lying empty. They can't use it for livestock or crops, and so we just have a bunch of derelict fields and a farmer in financial distress. And of course, don't know what will happen in the future. Maybe he sells the fields off. Maybe they build houses on them, and then the NIMBYs have got something else to complain about.
So what I'm hearing, Martin, is that basically having net zero skeptics in charge of the council probably won't actually change much anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, throw a dart at a map of the UK and have a look at the local council website to see if they declared a climate emergency. And in a lot of cases, you will see the same councillors blocking wind turbines, solar farms, railways, green infrastructure, you name it. Britain Remade published analysis back in 2023, which found that 70 councils had blocked something like 4.4 gigawatts of clean energy projects, many of whom had inevitably declared climate emergencies.
So this is obviously very depressing, but I dare say I'm not entirely surprised. It happens as well with groups like Just Stop Oil, where everyone really enjoys, waving their fists in the air, writing an inspiring poem and getting very angry about the climate. But then when it comes to actually meaningfully doing anything that might actually work, suddenly people get a lot more reticent.
Yeah, exactly. And take the example of County Durham, for example. When they signed their climate emergency declaration, they pointed out themselves that their emissions, their carbon footprint accounts for about 3% of the county. So whatever they're doing in terms of their own carbon emissions is absolutely pales into insignificance compared to the impacts that they can have through the planning system, through support for clean energy, infrastructure, and other projects like that. And it's this massive cognitive dissonance that's infuriating. I'm going to come back to Graham Morris again, the MP who's scared of solar panels. And he literally wrote, climate change is the most serious issue facing the planet. But then why aren't you taking it seriously? And like you say, I kind of suspect that for a lot of these people, it's almost like a role playing game. It's like, yeah, I can make big statements and sign declarations and prance around like Billy Big Balls talking about the climate crisis. But the moment they actually have to make a real decision with consequences, they absolutely just wet the bed.
Martin, let's sign a declaration that we won't put up with this any longer. So, Martin, before we get on with this week's guest, a quick reminder that if you're enjoying the Abundance Agenda this week, then grab your phone right now, go to your podcast app, give us 5 stars, and then copy the link and then, send it to a friend. Post it on your social media, post it on WhatsApp, share it with people who might like what we're doing. Like Martin said earlier, we've got enormous egos. So the bigger the numbers get, the more excited we are to keep making the show. But in addition to doing this, we also write our own Substack newsletters. So, Martin, what have you been writing about this week?
This week, I've got an extended version of the rant that I've just done, complete with links and extra details and basically stuff that'll get you nicely enraged for the rest of your day. What about you, James?
Well, funnily enough, I've also written about what I spoke about, which is these proposed amendments to the planning bill. Because, I got just quite mad when I saw this and I thought, I need to tell people about this so people care and people get angry about it. So, maybe quite a ragey week. But I also do want to plug something I wrote at the end of last week about Starmerism and the question of what it is. There's a big void at the heart of it. And my view is, well, what should the answer be? The answer should obviously be abundance. So you can go and read all about that on my Substack. You can find links to both of our posts on abundancepod.com. So let's get to our guest this week, and it's an exciting one. We've been speaking to Tom Copley, who's the Deputy Mayor of London for Housing and Residential Development. So someone who's actually working on building more homes in London, a place where I understand would quite like some more homes. So we're delighted to be joined now by Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor of London for Housing and Residential Development. Tom, thank you for joining us on the show. And we wanted to talk to you, first of all, because there was an announcement recently about a £2 billion City Hall Developer Investment Fund, which the Mayor of London has got his hands on, which is going to hopefully help create more housing in London. And we like the sound of that. So could you tell us a bit more about the fund and how it's all going to work?
Yeah, sure. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. So, the mayor has asked the government for what he's calling a City Hall Developer Investment Fund, and he's asked for up to £2 billion. And what this will allow City Hall to do is to invest in more creative ways into housing beyond just the grant that we give out as part of our affordable homes program. So, that's the grant that we give out to deliver social and other forms of affordable housing. It mostly goes to councils and to housing associations. So what the City Hall Developer Investment Fund would do is allow us to invest in more creative ways. It would be in things like loans, equity, financial transactions, essentially, and it would mostly be recyclable. So the funding that goes out after a period of time would be repaid to City Hall and can then be used again in the future for housing development. And this kind
Hmm.
of funding, again, it can be paid out to councils, it can be paid out to housing associations, it could also be paid out to private developers. And obviously, as part of that, we would be expecting those developers to be delivering higher levels of affordable housing. But it's a fantastic way of boosting overall housing as well as affordable housing. And if we get the £2 billion out of this, then we think that that could deliver 40 to 50,000 homes.
Maybe this is a silly question, but I look at London and see housing being very expensive. I see seemingly many plots of land just being built on instantly. What's the role of this sort of financing and all of these new methods for co-financing and so on? What's the purpose of that? Because surely, yeah, if you've got a plot of land in London, surely someone's just going to build on it anyway.
I mean, a lot of people might look at the London skyline and think, oh, there are a lot of cranes, there are buildings going up. But actually, in recent years, it's probably never been more difficult to build in London. There's been a whole confluence of issues that have arisen all at once, really, that has seriously impacted the housing sector in London. So we had, the big shocks of Brexit, the war in Ukraine, and things like that. Then we had things like rising financing costs, particularly as a result of Liz Truss's mini budget. We've had huge materials cost inflation, and we've had a really changing regulatory framework as well. The previous government brought in important, it has to be said, new safety regulations around second staircases. But of course, that all does come at a cost in order to put those new requirements into buildings. We've also had many sort of well publicized issues around the building safety regulator, which again, it's a really, really important new body. It's absolutely vital, particularly post Grenfell, during this building safety crisis that we've had, that we have a building safety regulator. But unfortunately, it has been very slow initially. It has had some capacity issues. Thankfully, the current government is in the process of sorting that out. They've appointed new leadership. They're taking it out of the health and safety executive and making it an agency. But all of these things taken together at the same time have really hit the housing sector's ability to deliver. And by being
Hmm.
able to offer more interesting, different, diverse forms of finance, we're going to be able to support the sector and support particularly some of those stalled developments at this very difficult time.
Are there any particular developments you've got your eye on that you want to try and support and see through to construction?
I've got a list. I've got a list, James. We're sort of the kind of big key strategic schemes we're very much across, and indeed we're very well across a whole range of schemes of different sizes. But we've been working very, very closely with boroughs, with the housing and development sector to ensure that we're across and we're sighted on, and we've got an idea about where this funding could have maximum impact.
And this isn't the only thing that's been going on in London housing news recently. So a few weeks ago, we talked about this on the show. Sadiq Khan came out and made a big announcement that he said it was time for London to start building on the green belts, or I guess the grey belts, as we now call it. So he's been mayor a long time. So could you talk about what prompted this announcement, and was there a sort of a moment when he changed his mind on the importance of this?
Well, Sadiq's been quite open about the fact that he did change his mind. And, I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said, when the facts change, I change my mind. The thing that has landed quite recently that has really led us to have to look again at the land supply in London is, of course, this really enormous housing needs assessment that the government has given us, this housing target of 88,000 homes per year, which has never been delivered in London. I mean, if you go back to the 1930s, I think
Hmm.
they managed 80,000 in one year. but it's this enormous uplift in the London housing target that means we have to really look beyond just the brownfield land supply that we've got. We'll always be, as is right, keen to develop brownfield first and have a brownfield first policy. But the scale of housing that we now need to deliver means that we have to look beyond just brownfield. And if you look at the green belt, I mean, the name can be, as I think we recognize, quite misleading in many cases. There is a lot of green belt that isn't that green. There's a lot of green belt that isn't even that biodiverse and certainly isn't accessible to the public. And actually, if you do this right, if you release Greenbelt in the right way, in the right places, and make sure that it's got good public transport connectivity, you can achieve kind of a triple whammy of delivering new housing, increasing access to the Greenbelt, and improving biodiversity at the same time.
Are there any sort of fun examples of that you like to point to? I think the one we talked about when the announcement was made on the show was one that I think is a closed down petrol station near Tottenham Hale or something, which is technically Greenbelt, and it's like 5 minutes from a tube station or something like that.
Yes, yes, that is one of the classic examples, the famous petrol station in Tottenham. But, I hear about, car parks, gravel pits, car showrooms, things like that are all located on the green belt. I mean, there was a great example recently, actually, of something very similar to what I just described in terms of a kind of almost a triple whammy of things. So there's an old rundown stately home in West London. I think it's called Hanwell House, and it's located in a very kind of overgrown, I think, bit of green belt that's not been well maintained, that I don't think is accessible. The borough approved and we approved an application which delivered the old stately building to be refurbished and brought into good use, the delivery of several hundred homes, of which 50% would be affordable, and massively improving the amenity value and the accessibility of the grounds around it. And actually, there was quite broad support from that. I think perhaps even from people who were very reluctant to build on the green belt because it delivered so many wins at the same time.
I'm going to ask you about the dirty business of politics very quickly before we get on to some more nerdy stuff, because obviously building on the green belt is always a bit controversial. I mean, we're very supportive on this show of building, but we know that Sadiq Khan came out and said we need to build on the green belt, and then there's rumours doing the rounds, and I don't expect you to to answer this directly, but there's rumours now that he is thinking of running for another term. That I think everyone was sort of assuming he wasn't. Do you think there's any sort of risk there politically of going, yeah, we're going to build on the green belt, and then trying to run for high office in London again?
Well, first of all, I think what I found quite remarkable after the announcement was how really how little kind of wailing and gnashing
Mm.
of teeth there was about it. I mean, look, there's a long way to go on the London plan. We've just concluded the initial consultation on it. Next year there'll be a draft published, and then there'll be the quasi judicial process we go through called examination in public. And it may be that at that point there are more voices clamoring against it. But what I was quite surprised about was how muted the opposition was. And I think it really helps that the government is pushing in the same direction on this. They've been very clear about what their expectations are around releasing grey belt. And I think that presents a real moment of opportunity, a historic moment actually, to make what is a significant change. I mean, I remember hearing people saying in the past, this kind of thing, oh, it's politically impossible. I believe we're going to prove, and Sadiq's going to prove that it's not.
Yeah, it's become a regular and slightly surprising, I think, to us theme of the podcast. We talked to various people, MPs, people who are trying to build these things, and actually, often the local opposition is less than you would think, but it's just very, very vocal in places. We've talked about the land, we've talked a bit about the financing, and other aspects of this is obviously the houses themselves, if we're trying to get more of them built. And in recent weeks, we've had discussions with people like Anne Breach, the censors for cities, around regulations for new builds. And you touched on this a little bit briefly earlier. Obviously, there are increased regulations for things like stairways in the wake of things like Grenfell. But there's also a lot of regulation from the 20th century around things like ventilation, dual aspects. And one of the things we've noticed is that, firstly, it's often different in different parts of the country and obviously in other countries as well. And there's often not very much consistency there. But it can also have a really big impact on things like the space that's available in a flat, the number of flats that you can build on a particular sites, is there also a role for starting to look at those things and revisit them and see if there are mechanisms or ways to update those going forwards?
Well, it's a very topical question, Martin, because I mentioned a moment ago the new London plan process that we're going through. And these are exactly the questions that we are asking. These are exactly the things that are on the table as part of that. Yeah, I'm very proud of the Mayor's 2021 London plan. It led the way on various things. And actually, there are, I think, things in it that now have been taken and put in place nationally as well. But we're very clear on the new London plan process that genuinely it's an open process. We are willing to look at everything as part of that. And that the next London plan is going to be a more streamlined document. We want to reduce duplication. We want to reduce layering. And we're absolutely clear that housing and growth are going to be at the heart of it. And if there are policies that were in the previous plan that were put in with the best of intentions, but perhaps they haven't worked in the way that we intended, perhaps they haven't provided the right incentive that we intended, or for whatever reason, they might not be relevant anymore, then we will look at those. But what I would also stress is that if we are going to be going and living at higher densities, as I think that we will, because going back to that huge target of 88,000 homes a year, this plan needs to plan for 888,000 homes over 10 years. That is going to require high density living. And if we're going to be living at high density, we do have to very much be mindful of quality and design quality. So these are exactly the discussions and the debates and the arguments that we are going to be having as part of the new London plan process. So I think it's a actually really exciting time for all those questions that you ask.
Absolutely, and I'll bring you to perhaps the most controversial question, and I'll understand if you want to duck away from answering this. But one of the topics that's come up is obviously we're going to be living at higher densities. We're also going to be living at higher temperatures. The Guardian recently have come out quite strongly against air conditioning. But as temperatures rise and as existing methods of ventilation in building codes become less effective, and as we move into an era of more renewable energy, there's surely a big opportunity to actually reverse that trend and actually move towards encouraging things like heat pumps and air conditioning in new builds. Is that something that might be on the table, or are you in the pay of big sweat?
I knew you were going to ask about air conditioning. I sort of had a
What
feeling
gave it away?
that was gonna be the question. It has suddenly bubbled up, funnily enough, given the temperatures that we've experienced recently as a big topic. And in a way, you're right, I'm not going to answer it, and I can't answer the question for the reasons that I've just set out, which is that we are asking all these questions as part of the next London plan making process, and it will absolutely the whole question of ventilation, of cooling and heating and energy, that is all going to be looked at as part of the plan making process. There was a bit of a myth that the current plan bans air conditioning. It doesn't. It discourages it and it encourages passive cooling first.
Mm.
But I did find that I did have a little laugh to myself when I saw because it's suddenly become the topic du jour.
I can't think why, but
Suddenly everyone's going, why don't we have air conditioning? And you think, well, it's only been relevant in the last few years because previously there wouldn't have been a market for it because we didn't get such heat. So that's part of the explanation. But also, I did see, I think it was Coutinho who did a video, expressing her kind of her shock and astonishment that we don't have air conditioning or promote it more widely. And of course, she may have forgotten that when she was energy secretary, I think it was her that explicitly prevented grants being given for reversible heat pumps. So it's funny how when ministers leave office, they can suddenly have a bout of amnesia about what went before. But anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of me saying that this is exactly the kind of thing that will be looked at as part of the next London plan, and we invite those comments and we invite that debate as part of this process.
Hello, James here. After the fact, just a quick one. So, in that last answer, Tom suggested that Claire Coutinho, the Shadow Energy Secretary, banned reversible heat pumps from getting grants. He's messaged to say since that he's realised this wasn't the case. In his view, the problem was that she didn't actually remove the existing ban when she was Energy Secretary for almost a year. So, with that correction, clarification, let's go back. Let's go back in time again.
So, following on from that a little bit, how do you start to navigate some of the trade offs between, for example, house building and other forms of infrastructure and things that we need space for? So, we're obviously big fans of things like railways and public transports and so on. But if you look at somewhere like Euston, there's a potential that we start to lock in limits on how big that can grow if we build housing or other stuff all the way around it. We see similar issues with things like the Thames Gateway Bridge, where potentially safeguarding for the route of that might be removed to allow more housing to be built. How do you try and balance those things within the process of developing these plans?
Well, thankfully, I was going to say that thankfully the job of balancing things is the job of my excellent colleague, the deputy mayor for planning. But I don't really see these things as really in conflict in the way that you kind of set out. In fact, if we're going to get more housing, we desperately need more transport
Mm.
infrastructure. So to zoom in on the part of London that you just referenced there around southeast London, we've just had the Silvertown Tunnel opening, which if the safeguarding is going to on the Thames Gateway Bridge is going to be lifted, it reflects the fact that a road crossing has already been
Yep.
delivered. But more importantly, from my perspective, we need the Docklands Light Railway extension. And what that piece of transport infrastructure delivers by creating two new stops, one at Beckton Riverside, one at Thamesmead Waterfront, that unlocks 30,000 homes on both sides of the river. So similarly, the other transport projects that are on the top of our list, the Bakerloo Line extension, the West London Orbital, all of these things, all of these pieces of transport infrastructure, taken together would deliver and support tens of thousands of homes. So I look at transport and housing very much as a sort of symbiotic, really. We can't get the housing that I want without the transport infrastructure that we need.
I am going to challenge you on something here, Tom. This is where I'm going to go all Paxmal on you. So I really want to ask you about Euston because this is something I'm particularly paranoid about because I consider myself, I'm like an ultra YIMBY, I think, at this point. I've been so radicalized. I want to build housing everywhere, except I am a bit nervous about the plans to develop in the vicinity of Euston Station. So originally, with HS2 being built and going to Euston, there was going to be 11 platforms. That was cut down to 6. And the plan, as I understand it, and you'll know better than I do, is to put housing in where the platforms would have been. But doesn't this create a sort of path dependency and lock in 6 platforms permanently in Euston so that in 2040, when Prime Minister Tom Copley wants to finally finish HS2 and connect it up to Manchester or something like that, we then won't have the platforms at Euston? So like how can we manage that and how can we know where to build? And particularly in the case of Euston, are we creating a path dependency there which could turn out badly in the future, is what I'm saying.
Well, I certainly hope not. And I've seen over the years that the HS has been going on. I'm pretty sure I've seen that number of platforms at Euston go down, up a bit, down a bit. Up. So I'm not convinced necessarily that where they're saying now is where we will end up. What I do know and what I do believe is that the whole area around Euston can support a lot more housing, and I think that that's really important. So
Hmm.
absolutely would not want us to throttle potentially, future expansion of HS2. And obviously, I was very, very disappointed when the previous government cancelled the Manchester leg. But that whole area, regardless, is going to and will support a lot more housing as well.
So obviously you're the deputy mayor of London for housing, and something we've discussed on the show in the past is that the mayoralty is it's a relatively weak office compared to the other like devolved cities like Manchester in terms of the powers they've got. Do you think that you and Sadiq Khan, do you need more power in the mayor's office? Should you take more powers down from Westminster, or do you need to pull more powers up from the various London boroughs if we really want to deliver on the 88,000 housing target?
I certainly wouldn't say we were weak, say, compared to Greater Manchester. But you're asking a deputy mayor of London, would they like more power? And I think the answer to that question is generally always going to be yes. I would like more power. I mean, having seen the devolution bill, I think there's some really interesting things in there that excite me. So, for example, mayoral the development orders and changing the rules around those to give the Mayor of London more leeway and more ability to introduce mayoral development orders, which allow you to create certain planning situations in certain places. So I'm quite excited by the direction of travel. But yes, I think probably if you ask a deputy mayor of London would they like more power, the answer is probably going to be yes.
Is there anything specific you would like to ask for or would like to have the power to do that you can't at the moment?
Probably. I mean, generally, what we've got and what is on the way in terms of devolved power, and specifically in relation to my brief and in relation to planning, I think are pretty good. And like I say, I was very excited by what's in there on MDOs. So broadly speaking, quite happy about that.
And very finally, I know we've just got a grab bag of topics here, but there's all sorts of things we can ask you about. But I do want to ask you about one last thing, which is the spending review recently. It was a bit annoying for London. There wasn't any cash for London in the same way that there was for other parts of the country. I think particularly the Bakerloo extension didn't get any money for it. So this is just, I guess it remains on paper for now. From your perspective, as someone who's got to try and, build more housing in the capital, does that make your job more annoying? And is it going to harm London's ability to meet its housing targets?
Well, going back to what we were just talking about
Mm.
Southeast London, I was really disappointed, and the mayor's, said this. I was really disappointed that we didn't quite get the green light for the Docklands Light Railway extension. I think it is going to unlock 30,000 homes. It is a relatively cheap piece of transport infrastructure. I mean, certainly if you put it next to HS2, I mean, it's just absolutely
Mm.
tiny in terms of what it requires. And I think that for the amount of funding that we need, it unlocks so much. So yeah, I was disappointed about that, and I was also, obviously disappointed we didn't get any more on the Bakerloo line extension as well, because that is another key piece of transport infrastructure that is absolutely vital for housing development along the Old Kent Road. So look, it's not like it's game over. There's still things to play for London, and I'm hopeful that on the DLR extension, particularly, I know that the discussions are continuing about that. So I'm hopeful that in the future we will get that investment.
On that note, we'll leave it there and let you get back to, doing actually important things like trying to build houses in the capital. So for now, Tom Copley, thank you very much. Martin, and that's just about it for this week's show. How do you think it's gone?
Yeah, James, we're 20 episodes in, so either this is going well or it's a chronic waste of time. We'll soon find out, I guess.
Yeah, and a bit of an angry one this week. So hopefully next week we'll be talking about something a bit more chill. But so tune in then to find out what's going on in the world of abundance. In the meantime, read our Substacks, read our newsletters. Links are on abundancepod.com. But yeah, for now, thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next week.